Hey everyone. If you've ever felt like you've given everything, your time, your heart, your soul, to people who didn't even see you, this story is for you. It's not just about heartbreak, it's about waking up. It's about finding your voice when the world tried to silence it. I'm Helen, and this is my story. Make sure to hit that subscribe button, like, and share where you're watching from in the comments. I want to hear your stories too. Let's dive in. The sound of the kettle whistling always felt like a small victory in the mornings. It cut through the quiet of the house, a signal that the day was starting, that I was still here, still moving. I'd shuffle across the cold linoleum floor in my slippers, the ones with the frayed edges, and pour boiling water into a chipped mug. The steam would curl up, carrying the faint scent of chamomile, and for a moment, I'd feel like I could breathe. That morning, though, the air felt heavier, like it was holding something back. I didn't know it yet, but that was the day everything changed. I was 62, a nurse for nearly 40 decades, and I'd spent the last 10 years living in my cousin Paul's house, taking care of his elderly parents, Aunt Marie and Uncle George. It wasn't really Paul's house, though. It was mine. I'd bought it 20 years ago with the inheritance from my parents, a modest two-story with creaky stairs and a backyard that bloomed wild with roses I'd planted myself. I'd invited Paul and his wife, Diane, to move in after Aunt Marie's stroke, when it became clear they couldn't manage her care alone. I didn't ask for rent. I didn't ask for thanks. I just did what I always did, gave. That morning, I was prepping breakfast for Aunt Marie, mashing bananas into her oatmeal because she couldn't chew solids anymore. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and coffee, and the radio played a soft gospel tune, the kind that used to make her hum along before her voice faded. Paul was upstairs, probably still asleep, and Diane was in the living room, scrolling through her phone, her manicured nails tapping the screen. I could hear the faint clink of her bracelets, a sound that always seemed to announce her presence before she spoke. The house was buzzing with preparations for the family reunion that evening. It was a big deal. Relatives from 3 states were coming, and I had spent weeks planning. I'd scrubbed the floors, polished the silverware, ordered the catering, and even hung fairy lights in the backyard, twisting them around the rose trellis until my fingers ached. I wanted it to be perfect, not for me, but for them, for the family I'd held together through hospital visits, late-night emergencies, and the quiet moments when Aunt Marie would grip my hand and whisper, "You're a blessing, Helen." But that evening, as the backyard filled with laughter and the clatter of plates, I felt the first crack in my heart. The tables were laden with food I'd paid for: roast beef, mashed potatoes, green beans glistening with butter. The air smelled of charcoal in summer, and the fairy lights cast a golden glow over everyone's faces. I was carrying a tray of lemonade, weaving through cousins and aunts, when Evelyn's mother, Evelyn, caught my eye. She was a tall woman, all sharp angles and sharper smiles, her pearl earrings catching the light. "And you are?" she asked, her voice dripping with that polite condescension people use when they think you're beneath them. I opened my mouth to answer, but Diane beat me to it. She laughed, a high, tinkling sound that cut through the chatter. "Oh, that's Helen," she said, waving a hand like she was dismissing a fly. "Our live-in nurse. Keeps the place running." The backyard erupted in laughter. Cousins, uncles, even Paul, who was standing by the grill with a beer in his hand, chuckled like it was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. I stood there, the tray heavy in my arms, the cold glass pitcher sweating against my palms. My smile froze, polite, practiced, but inside I felt the ground shift, like the earth itself was pulling away from me. My heart didn't break all at once. It crumbled, piece by piece, as the laughter lingered, as no one, not even Paul, corrected her. Not one of them said, That's family. That's Helen, who gave us everything. I set the tray down on the nearest table, my hands trembling so slightly no one would notice. "Excuse me," I said, my voice steady, and I walked back into the house. The screen door creaked behind me, and their laughter followed, sharp as a knife. I made it to my bedroom, tucked in the corner of the first floor, a small space with a single bed and a dresser I'd painted blue years ago. I sat on the edge of the mattress, staring at the wall where I'd hung a photo of me and Paul as kids running through a sprinkler in this very backyard. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there, feeling the silence settle over me, like dust. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept replaying Diane's words, Paul's laugh, the way Evelyn's eyes had skimmed over me like I was part of the furniture. I thought about the mortgage I'd paid off, the nights I'd stayed up adjusting Aunt Marie's IV, the mornings I'd driven Paul to dialysis before my own shift at the hospital. I'd given up my apartment, my savings, my time, everything for them. And in one sentence, Diane had reduced me to nothing, the live-in nurse, not family, not Helen. I set the keys on the counter, the kitchen key, the garage key, the mailbox key. They clinked softly, a small sound that felt louder than it should. "What's this?" she asked, turning, her brow furrowed like I had interrupted something important. I smiled, the same polite smile I'd worn the night before. "Good luck keeping the house without me." She blinked, her lips parting. "What?" I didn't answer. I picked up my purse, the same one I'd carried when I moved into this house, and my coat, the one I'd worn when I brought Aunt Marie home from the hospital after her stroke. I walked past the photos I'd hung, the curtains I'd sewn, the roses I'd planted. I didn't take anything else. I didn't need to. The house was mine, legally, emotionally, but I was done carrying it. Paul was in the driveway, grabbing something from his car, when I stepped outside. "Helen," he called, his voice confused. "Where are you going?" I kept walking, my shoes crunching on the gravel. He followed, his steps hesitant. "Alan, wait. What's going on?" I opened my car door, the old Honda that still smelled faintly of the lavender air freshener I liked. I didn't slam it. I closed it gently, deliberately, because what I felt wasn't anger. It wasn't even grief. It was clarity, sharp and cold and terrifying. I knew in that moment that I was done being invisible. I didn't know where I was going, not exactly, but I knew I wasn't staying. In the rearview mirror, I saw Paul standing there, his hands in his pockets, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. He didn't know what he just lost, and honestly, neither did I. Not yet. They say you don't realize you're drowning until you take your first real breath. That first night in the cabin, my grandmother had left me. I didn't feel free. I felt hollow. The cabin was tucked in a rural corner of the county, a small wooden structure with peeling paint and a porch that sagged under the weight of time. It smelled of pine and dust, and the heater groaned like it was arguing with the cold. I dropped my purse on the kitchen table, a scarred oak thing that wobbled, and stood there staring at the cracked linoleum floor. I didn't know if I was supposed to cry or scream or just keep moving. So I did nothing. I just stood there, letting the silence wrap around me. The cabin was a gift from my grandmother, Esther, who'd passed 5 years ago. She'd always called it her quiet place, where she'd go when the world got too loud. I hadn't been here since her funeral, when I'd helped clean it out, boxing up her old quilts and mothballs. Now it was mine, the only thing I had left that wasn't tied to Paul or Diane or the house I'd given everything to. I slept on the couch that first night, the springs creaking under me, because the bed in the tiny bedroom smelled too much like her, lavender and mothballs, and I wasn't ready to face that. For days, I moved like a shadow. I ate canned soup heated in a microwave that hummed too loudly. I drank tea from a chipped mug I found in the cupboard. I didn't call anyone, not because I had no one, but because no one called me. Paul didn't text. Diane didn't email. Not a word. I wondered if Diane had told him not to reach out, or if, and this was worse, he just didn't care. I kept replaying that moment in the backyard, the way Paul's laugh had blended with the others, the way he'd looked right through me. I'd raised him in a way after his parents took me in when I was orphaned at 15. I'd been his big cousin, his confidant, his protector. I'd worked night shifts at the hospital to help pay for his college, cleaned up after his mistakes, and when Aunt Marie and Uncle George needed care, I'd stepped in without a second thought.
And now I was the live-in nurse. I started writing at night, scribbling in an old notebook I found in a drawer, the kind with a spiral binding that caught my fingers if I turned the pages too fast. I wrote about the things I'd never said out loud, how I'd wait in the kitchen for Paul to say thank you, how I'd cry in the bathroom when Diane planned family dinners without inviting me, how I'd lie awake listening to them laugh about my old-fashioned scrubs in the living room I paid for. The words spilled out, messy and raw, not for anyone to read, just for me to breathe. One afternoon, while rummaging for a flashlight in the cabin's attic, I found a wooden box tucked under a pile of quilts. It was heavy, carved with my grandmother's initials, E.M. I pried it open, expecting old recipes or sewing patterns. Instead, I found letters, dozens of them, yellowed and tied with twine. One was addressed to me, in Esther's careful cursive, dated a year before her death. If you're reading this, Helen, it means you've come to the quiet place. I'm sorry it took so much to get you here. My heart thudded as I unfolded the pages. They were fragile, smelling of time. Esther had been a nurse, too, before she retired, and the letters were her own stories, her own years of giving, of being the backbone for a family that took her for granted. She wrote about caring for her in-laws, about being called the help at a family gathering, about the moment she walked away to this cabin and never looked back. There were other letters, too, from women she'd helped, caregivers like her who'd felt invisible. She'd started a small support group here, in this very cabin, a place for women to share their stories and find strength. At the bottom of the box was a photograph of her, standing on the porch, surrounded by women holding mugs, smiling like they'd found something precious. I read every letter, my hands shaking. Esther hadn't just left me a cabin. She'd left me a legacy, a map to something I didn't know I needed. I didn't feel rage or grief. I felt awake, like I'd been sleepwalking for years and someone had finally shaken me. The woman I saw in the cabin's cracked bathroom mirror wasn't the same Helen who'd left Paul's house. She was broken, yes, but she was starting to see herself. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't ashamed of her. There's a kind of silence that doesn't comfort you. It punishes you, sits heavy on your chest until you can't breathe. That was the silence I lived in for weeks after finding Esther's letters. I carried them like a secret, rereading them by candlelight when the power flickered, trying to understand who I was now. The Helen who'd cared for Aunt Marie and Uncle George, who paid for Paul's life, wasn't the same woman holding those pages. But who was I? I started small. I cleaned the cabin, swept the dust from the corners, polished the windows until they let in the pale winter light. I planted herbs in pots on the porch, their green tips pushing through the soil like a promise. I didn't reach out to Paul. I didn't know what to say, and he didn't call again. Diane posted photos on social media, brunch dates, yoga retreats, her perfect smile. But I noticed the captions were shorter, less confident. I didn't dig deeper. Not yet. I was still learning how to exist without carrying their weight. One evening, the heater gave out, and I bundled up in one of Esther's old quilts, the letters spread across my lap. I read them again, each one a story of a woman who'd given too much and found her way back. There was a pattern: grief, silence, then action. Esther had written about a moment when she'd stood in town watching a community center where women gathered and felt a pull to do more. I didn't know what more looked like for me, but I knew I couldn't stay still. The next morning, I drove into town, a small place called Willow Creek, with a main street lined with brick storefronts and a diner that smelled of bacon and maple syrup. I parked across from the community center, a low building with a mural of wildflowers painted on the side. I didn't go in. I just watched, sipping coffee from a paper cup, as women came and went, some with tired eyes, others with determined steps. I saw myself in them, the ones who carried too much, who gave until they vanished. That became my ritual. Every few days, I'd sit outside the community center, watching, not stalking, just observing. I noticed the rhythm of the place: support groups on Tuesdays, art classes on Thursdays, a knitting circle on weekends. I started writing again, not just my pain, but ideas. What if I started something? A group, like Esther's, for caregivers who felt unseen. I jotted down names, schedules, resources. It wasn't a plan yet, just a seed. Meanwhile, I couldn't help but notice Paul and Diane's world unraveling. Diane's social media posts stopped mentioning the house. A neighbor I ran into at the grocery store mentioned they'd seen a for sale sign in the yard. Then it disappeared. I checked the county records on a whim, using the library's computer. The house was still in my name, and their attempts to refinance had failed. Again. They couldn't afford the mortgage without me, and Paul hadn't worked in months, living off Diane's influencer gigs, which were clearly faltering. I didn't act, not yet. I was still learning how to exist without carrying their weight. The first time I spoke to someone at the community center, I almost turned back. It was a cold Tuesday, the kind where your breath hangs in the air. I'd been watching the support group through the window, a circle of women in folding chairs, their voices muffled but warm. I pushed open the door, my heart pounding, and a young woman looked up from the front desk. She was maybe 30, with braided hair and a kind smile. Her name tag read Anna. "Hi," I said, my voice smaller than I wanted. "I'm Helen. I was wondering about the caregiver group." Anna's eyes lit up. "You're a caregiver?" I was, then I corrected myself. Am. I took care of family for years. She nodded, like she understood more than I'd said. "You're in the right place. Group's just starting. Want to sit in?" I hesitated, my hand tightening around my purse strap. But something in her voice, her lack of judgment, made me stay. I sat in the back, listening as women shared stories of exhaustion, of being taken for granted, of loving people who didn't see them. I didn't speak that day, but I listened, and it felt like coming up for air. I went back the next week, then the next. Anna started recognizing me, waving when I walked in. We talked about small things, her nursing school classes, my years at the hospital. One day, she asked why I stopped caregiving. I told her about the reunion, about Diane's words, about Paul's silence. I didn't mention the house or Esther's letters, not yet. But Anna listened, her eyes steady, and said, "You didn't deserve that. But you're here now. That's what matters." Those words stayed with me. I started speaking in the group, sharing bits of my story. The women nodded, some with tears in their eyes. I realized I wasn't alone. I'd never been alone. I just hadn't known where to look. At night, I kept writing, but the notebook wasn't enough anymore. I bought a used laptop from a pawn shop and typed up my notes, stories from the group, Esther's letters, my own thoughts. I wasn't just grieving now. I was planning. I wanted to start a group of my own, not just for caregivers, but for anyone who'd felt invisible. I called it the Quiet Place, after Esther's cabin. I rented a room at the community center, using my savings, and put up flyers around town. Anna offered to help, spreading the word to her classmates. The first meeting was small, 5 women, including Anna, sitting in a circle with coffee and store-bought cookies. I was nervous, my voice shaking as I read from Esther's letters. But they listened. They shared. One woman, Carla, talked about caring for her disabled son while her husband dismissed her exhaustion. Another, June, spoke about being the fixer for her siblings, never thanked. We cried, we laughed, and for the first time, I felt seen. Paul called me a month after I left. I was in the cabin typing up notes from the latest Quiet Place meeting when my phone buzzed. His name on the screen felt like a punch. I let it go to voicemail. His voice was tired, strained. "Helen, we need to talk. Things are bad. Diane's freaking out. The house, can you call me?" I didn't call back. I didn't want to hear excuses. But I checked the records again. The house was still mine, and their attempts to refinance had failed again. Diane's influencer brand was crumbling. Sponsorships dropped, her posts less frequent. I heard from a mutual friend that her parents had stopped helping financially, embarrassed by the rumors of debt. I could have sold the house right then, but I didn't. I wanted them to feel the weight of their choices, the way I had. Instead, I focused on the Quiet Place. The group grew. 10 women, then 15. Anna became my right hand, helping with flyers, bringing snacks, sharing her own story of caring for her sick mother while studying. We started a newsletter, sharing anonymous stories from the group. People in town noticed. The diner owner offered to cater our meetings for free. A local artist painted a sign for the community center door, the Quiet Place,
where your voice matters. One evening, Anna asked me to join her for coffee outside the group. We sat at the diner, the smell of fries and coffee grounding me. She leaned forward, her eyes serious. "You're changing lives, Helen. You know that, right?" I shook my head, embarrassed. "I'm just doing what my grandmother did." "No," she said. "You're doing more. You're giving us a place to be heard." That night, I wrote in my notebook, "I was a woman who gave until I vanished. Now I'm the woman who listens, who builds, who stays." The first time I saw Paul again, it wasn't planned. I was at the community center setting up chairs for a Quiet Place meeting when he walked in. He looked older, his hair graying at the temples, his shoulders slumped. I froze, my hand on a chair, as he stood in the doorway, hesitant. "Helen," he said, his voice low, "can we talk?" I nodded, leading him to a corner of the room. Anna glanced over, her eyes protective, but I waved her off. We sat, the silence between us heavy. "Why are you doing this?" he asked finally. "The house. You're selling it." "I'm taking it back," I said, my voice steady. "It was always mine." He looked at the floor. "I didn't know it hurt you, what Diane said. I thought you were okay with it." I almost laughed. "Okay with being called your nurse? With you laughing?" He winced. "I didn't mean to. Diane's life, it's all about appearances. I got caught up in it." "That's not an excuse," I said. "I raised you, Paul. I gave you everything, my home, my time, my heart, and you let her erase me." He didn't deny it. His eyes were glassy. "I'm losing everything. The house, Diane's business, my parents' care. I don't know what to do." I looked at him, the boy I'd once bandaged knees for, the man who'd stood by while I was humiliated. "You gave it away," I said. "Not me." He nodded, his hands trembling. "Can we fix this?" I didn't answer right away. I thought of Esther's letters, of the women in my group, of Anna's smile. "I don't know," I said finally, "but it's not my job to fix it anymore." He left, his steps heavy, and I went back to setting up chairs. The meeting that night was the biggest yet. 20 women sharing stories, laughing, crying. Anna read a poem she'd written about her mother, and I felt a warmth I hadn't known in years. I was building something. Not for Paul, not for Diane, but for me. The house sold in the spring. I got the full asking price, more than I had expected. Paul and Diane had to move out within 30 days. I didn't evict them out of spite. I did it because that house was my prison, and I needed to be free. I drove past on the day the moving truck came, watching from a distance as Diane directed movers, her face hidden behind sunglasses. Paul stood on the lawn, his phone pressed to his ear, pacing. I didn't stop. I didn't need to. Their world was crumbling, not with a bang, but with the quiet weight of consequences. I used part of the sale money to fund the quiet place. We expanded, renting a bigger room, buying supplies, starting a website. Anna designed it, her fingers flying over her laptop as she added stories and resources. The group became a haven, not just for caregivers, but for anyone who'd felt unseen. We had teachers, mothers, daughters, all finding their voices. A local newspaper wrote about us, calling it a movement of quiet strength. I didn't care about the attention. I cared about the women who walked in nervous and left with their heads higher. Paul texted me one day in April. "Can we meet just once?" I stared at the message, my thumb hovering over the screen. It wasn't angry or demanding. It was tired, like he'd finally let go of something. I agreed to meet at a park outside town, a place with rusted benches and a dry pond, neutral ground with no memories. He was there when I arrived, sitting with his hands clasped, looking like the boy I'd known decades ago. I sat beside him, keeping my distance. He said he wasn't here to ask for anything. He just wanted to understand. I pulled a folder from my bag, copies of Esther's letters, not the whole story, but enough. I handed it to him. "This is who I am," I said. "Read it." He took it, his fingers brushing the pages. He got the house appraised. He didn't know it was all you, the mortgage, everything. "You never asked," I said. He nodded, his eyes wet. "I thought I was helping Diane build something, but I was wrong. About her. About you. You let her write the story, and you handed her the pen." He looked at the pond, leaves skittering across its cracked surface. "I wish I could undo it." "You can't," I said, but my voice wasn't harsh. It was just true. We sat in silence, two people who'd shared a life now facing its ruins. Then he said, "I'm proud of you, the group. I heard about it." I looked at him, startled. "Thank you," I said, and meant it. "I don't want to hurt you, but if there's ever a place for me, even a small one—" "I'll think about it," I said. I stood, brushing off my coat, and placed a hand on his shoulder for a moment. Then I walked away, not with anger, but with peace. I didn't need to fix him. I didn't need to be fixed. I just needed to be free. By summer, the Quiet Place was more than a group. It was a community. We held workshops, invited guest speakers, even started a scholarship for caregivers going back to school. Anna applied, her eyes bright when she got accepted into a nursing program. She hugged me, calling me her mentor, and I felt a pride I hadn't known before. One afternoon, I was at the community center, setting up for a meeting, when Anna handed me a key. It was small, brass, attached to a ribbon. "What is this?" I asked. She smiled. "The town council gave us the back room permanently. They heard about your work. This is your space now." I turned the key over, feeling its weight. The room was simple. White walls, wooden floors, a window overlooking the wildflower mural. But it felt like mine, like the cabin, like Esther's legacy. I hung a sign above the door, "The Quiet Place." Inside, I set up chairs, a tea kettle, a shelf for books and journals. It wasn't grand, but it was real. That night, I sat in the cabin, my notebook open, the last page blank. I wrote, "I was a woman who gave until I vanished. Then I became the woman who built something new, not with noise, not with vengeance, but with silence, with truth, and with the strength they never saw coming. I donated part of the sale money to a foundation for caregivers, women like me who'd been dismissed, underestimated. They called to thank me, but I didn't need it. Every time I walked into the quiet place, saw Anna's smile, heard a woman share her story, I remembered who I was. Not Paul's cousin, not Diane's nurse, but Helen Carter, survivor, builder, keeper of her own story. Thank you for listening. If this story resonated with you, hit that subscribe button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? And what's your story? Your voice matters. Let's keep building this community together.